Therein lies your problem, Mr. Bond. Words are the new weapons. Satellites, the new artillery.
Jonathan Pryce's villain, Elliot Carver, says to James Bond in Tomorrow Never Dies, right before he manipulates a GPS signal to make a British destroyer begin a confrontation with the Chinese military. The idea of manipulating GPS signals and disrupting communications has long been a staple of spy thrillers like our favorite James Bond films. But while these scenarios make for thrilling entertainment, the reality is far more complex and consequential. The invisible threads of satellite technology puppet our every move, from the ships traversing vast oceans to the cars navigating city streets. At the heart of this intricate web lies the Global Navigation Satellite System, GNSS, a constellation of satellites that provide precise positioning, navigation, and timing, PNT, information to countless devices across the globe. Recent news stories have highlighted the vulnerabilities of GNSS, from the possibility of signal jamming and spoofing to the potential for widespread disruption in the event of a satellite failure. This isn't just in movies. A recent book by Washington Post columnist David Ignatius about a Russian space scientist who finds evidence of a system kill switch that can turn off the global positioning system, on which every aspect of U.S. communications, transportation, and our economic lifeline depends on. These risks are not just the stuff of fiction. They have real-world implications for our increasingly interconnected society. Fortunately, advancements in alternate position and timing systems offer a promising solution. By harnessing the power of ground-based infrastructure, these technologies provide a resilient and secure alternative to satellite-based navigation, ensuring that our critical systems remain operational even in the face of adversity. How can microchip technology help in securing our critical infrastructure and help world leaders chart a course towards a future where the doomsday scenarios remain firmly in the realm of fiction? Let's go beyond the microchip and hear a story of empowering innovation to enhance the human experience. Our guest today is Greg Wolf. Greg is Senior Technical Product Marketing Engineer at Microchip Technology, working out of the Frequency and Timing Systems business unit. He joins us today from our global headquarters in Chandler, Arizona. Welcome, Greg.
Glad to be here, Dana.
Nice to have you here. Thank you for joining us on Beyond the Microchip. In the intro, we briefly talked about our favorite spy movies and how some of their more outlandish plot points aren't so detached from reality. That's where positioning, navigation, and timing, PNT, comes in. Tell us about it.
Yeah, it's an interesting chain of events that have occurred, really, when you look back at the very beginning of PNT, and more specifically at the beginning of GPS, more broadly speaking, GNSS. Nations really unknowingly have become incredibly dependent on GNSS. We're all using it every day,
right,
for lots of different reasons.
Phones, navigation, yep.
You know, you got it. And now, with frankly the unfortunate events we're observing around the world, right? We're seeing that this utility, this kind of invisible utility, is vulnerable. It's vulnerable in many ways. It's vulnerable for unintentional because of unintentional disruptions which can occur. But unfortunately, what we're seeing now is intentional disruptions of the signal. Not only, as you described, in just a specific location, but it can be very widespread. And there's parts of the world where GNSS is simply not available. It's incredible to even think about. And this has led countries to look at GNSS and the protection of GNSS and the needs of PNT as a national security issue.
Right.
Okay. You know, and that's where we're at today. I just came back from a conference just this last week. It was a conference called Workshop on Synchronization and Timing Systems. This workshop has experts really from across the globe coming together, sharing ideas, sharing strategies, trying to figure out how do we safeguard PNT? Mm-hmm. How do we protect ourselves from the scenario that you just described in the movie, which may be a movie scene, but it's now become real world in many ways. So we'll talk about that more maybe later on. But, before we kind of jump into alternatives to GNSS, I wanted to talk about GNSS in light of it being such a successful technology for so many decades, literally decades. And it's explained to everybody kind of what is GNSS. It's really a fairly simple system. You can think of it in 3 segments. Okay. There's first segment is called the control segment.
Right.
Okay. This is the segment that sits on the ground. Okay. Then there's the space segment, right? These are a collection of satellites that are orbiting around the Earth. Okay. And then the third segment is the user segment. And the user segment is the consumer of the GNSS PNT information, right? The consumer receives the signal. They'll have some kind of device. Could be a phone, could be a car.
We're talking line of sight, right?
Yeah. Well, it could be a battleship, right? I mean, well, you have line of sight. You have sight of the satellite up in space, right? You know, you have access to it anywhere in the world. That's what's key, right? It's a global service, really. And this simple architecture of control segment, space segment, user segment has worked wonderfully. Okay. It's been a fantastic utility that the world has benefited from. There's many, in fact, papers out there discussing how billions and billions of dollars are dependent on GNSS. So having said that, I think it's important not to lose sight that GNSS has worked well, continues to work well, but there's now been this pivot, if you will, right, where we've become overly dependent on it. And furthermore, it's been brought into light by the unfortunate situations we see in our world where the signal's been disrupted, not just in a small way, but in large ways.
Right.
Yeah.
We talked to Clayton Pillion from the Silicon Carbide business unit, and we were talking about how everything is electrified. And what's become electrified as part of that discussion was maps. Does anybody have a Rand McNally 1-inch thick book in their car anymore?
I don't.
They don't. I mean, it's very rare to see that, at least in modern economies. I'm sure there are still places where you would want to have a map. But for the most part, you don't keep a book of maps in your vehicle anymore. You've got your phone, or you've got a Garmin, or you've got something that tells you where you want to go. It's no longer something that you have. It's now something that you rely on. So the idea that that could be disrupted in any way paints a pretty bleak picture of the possibilities. Clearly, nothing's happening right now. It's just the possibility of it.
Yeah. It's interesting. The big word as it relates to this issue is resilience, right? And being able to have a disruption occur, but to be able to have some level of defense against that disruption, to be able to withstand it, if you will, to be able to continue to operate without it, right? You lose your map, you still need to figure out where you're going, right? Pull out your compass.
Right.
You need an alternative.
Right.
Be able to continue to operate and ultimately be able to recover back, right, to where you were before. So resilience is really what it's all about. That's the goal here. And the question is, how do you create that resilience? Certainly one way, and there's been a lot of great work done in this area, is to better protect and secure the GNSS signal itself, right? Find ways, create ways to be able to receive the signal when there's adversity, when there's adverse conditions around. Be able to...
Is there typically trouble in the signal from space to the user or from space to command?
Great question. I think what most are seeing is from the satellite to the user. And they're seeing it in kind of 2 forms. There's 2 terms that are very popular in their use. One is jamming,
yep.
And one is spoofing, right? Mm-hmm. And jamming is the idea where you would physically disrupt the signal.
Completely cut them off.
Exactly. I mean, when you think about this, the GPS satellite is what they call mid-Earth orbit satellite, right? It's about 12,000 miles from the surface of the Earth. So by the time that signal reaches the Earth's surface, it's incredibly low power, all right? And so it's not a difficult signal to disrupt. You know, there's all sorts of different types of jamming devices out there, ranging from devices you can stick into your car cigarette lighter, mm-hmm. to devices that are capable of, killing the signal, destroying the signal in very, very large geographical areas.
Right.
So that's jamming. Spoofing is a little bit different, and it's a lot more like what we think of as network hacking, if you will, right? Spoofing is literally altering the data that is within that GPS signal such that the end user can be fooled. To your point, back to the maps, right? Spoofing is a technique that would be used that says, hey, I'm, driving from downtown San Diego to La Jolla, and all of a sudden you got this map telling you you're over in Tijuana or something, right? I mean, it's a way of disrupting data to a point where you're fooled into thinking you're somewhere where you're not, or you're going into a certain direction that you're not. And it's back to the movie scene, right?
Right.
It really can happen.
Yeah. So our favorite movies are when the bad guy disrupts something to cause trouble for the good guy, and then the good guy's got to go in and fix it.
Yeah.
But very often it's just the nature of the technologies. In order to go, because we haven't talked about orbits yet, but if you're 12,000 miles up, even at the speed of radio communication, it still takes time to get there, and it doesn't sound like it's encrypted.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you go back to the history of GPS. This is a really important point. When GPS was created, this is as I may have mentioned or not before, there's actually 4 main constellations out there.
That's right. Yep.
One being GPS, the United States version, a second being Galileo, that's out of primarily Western Europe. Then you have GLONASS, which is Russia's version, and you have Beidou, which is the China version. When the United States came out with GPS, they actually came out with 2 versions. There was the civilian version, which is not encrypted.
Right.
Okay. And then there was the military version, which is encrypted. And so there was this separation, and, smartly, our military has an encrypted version. What was unexpected, what occurred that no one anticipated, was the massive proliferation of the civilian GPS receiver. Okay. It happened quickly as well, right? And more specifically, what was not anticipated was that these civilian receivers would find their way into critical infrastructure. So the civilian receiver, which was maybe thought of, hey, let's put it in a car, let's put it on in a phone, or maybe even put it on a boat, right? But now all of a sudden, these GPS receivers, the civilian versions, were being used to time the electrical grid, were being used to time our mobile networks, were being used to provide timing for data centers, for example. And so it was the use of civilian receivers in critical infrastructure that was a big driver for creating kind of this vulnerability concern that everyone's thinking about right now.
All right. So it's kind of a gray area between recreational use, so to speak, and military use.
Yeah.
That kind of gets to what we were talking about before about that Netflix movie.
Yeah.
Leave the World Behind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the one that we were talking about was the Teslas that were crashing into each other. You see that in the trailer, so no spoilers for those of you that haven't seen it yet. And the other one we were talking about was the boat. Can you talk about the boat?
Yeah, the boat scene was amazing to watch. Wow. We've got this family sitting on the beach, and this young lady watching this large, I think some kind of a cargo
it was a tanker,
ship, a tanker, if I recall. Yeah. And it's way out there in the ocean. And she's sitting there just staring at it slowly moving towards the beach. And then as it gets closer and closer, it's not moving so slowly anymore.
Yeah. She's saying, is that ship coming towards us? And the dad's like, no, I can't possibly. And she's like, I think it's coming towards us.
Right. And that's another, it's a classic example of a spoof attack, for example, misleading the ship all the way to the shore of a beach. Not out of the realm of possibility by any means.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's because of this proliferation you're talking about.
Exactly. These types of critical infrastructure, whether it's large transportation like container ships or railway or aviation, they don't have access to the military version receivers. They only have access to the civilian versions. And again, look over at back to data centers for a moment. I mean, our world is becoming our lives are becoming increasingly dependent on large cloud service providers, data center infrastructure, all of which is, driven by database access, reading and writing things out of a database.
Mm-hmm.
And more of those databases are becoming distributed. They're not all in one spot, right? They're distributed. And so how do you make sure that you write something into a database in time before you read it and make sure you get the right answer, right? It's all based on timing.
You were talking about this with regards to financial markets. How do you manage transactions to make sure that it's up and up where it's supposed to be, right?
Absolutely. I mean, our financial world, the world economic system is so dependent on timing and only getting increasingly more dependent on timing. And I think an important point to make when it comes to financial timing is you got to bring in the word traceability.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There's the master clock, right? The real master clock of the world is referred to as universal coordinated time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Although the acronym itself is UTC.
UTC, yeah.
Anyways. And the end goal for a lot of financial institutions is to be traceable to UTC, right? They want to be able to timestamp financial transactions, but they need to have absolute accuracy in those timestamps.
They need a standard. Yeah.
Exactly. And so they need to have traceability to UTC. And again, it's back, GNSS has been a wonderful technology. It's been uniquely capable of providing this capability in mostly a very economical and cost-effective manner. But, now could you, I mean, I don't know that I could imagine, right? I mean, no. I need to look at my stock portfolio if someone disrupted our economic system. That wouldn't be fun. So
no, I think of it, this goes to a different conversation. We should probably have an entirely different episode on it. But the idea of a tool was designed for a purpose, and somebody misusing the tool, you never thought of it that way. You never thought that it would be manipulated in that way because it's just so useful. It's so easy to interface with. It's just not something we think about. But that's kind of what leads us to what we're talking about today is you want to have an alternative, right?
Absolutely. Or maybe multiple alternatives.
Right.
I think when you look at GPS, and I mentioned before the architecture, this whole idea, right, of control, space, user, it's a great architecture. But it's an architecture that follows what I call the, what I like to refer to, or some of our engineers maybe gave me this term, honestly, is this leader-follower model,
mm-hmm.
Okay? Where there's kind of one leader and many followers. That's how, in the case of the use of timing, the timing element
mm-hmm.
of GNSS has been used, a leader-follower model, and that creates the single point of failure. If you really think about it, right? I mean, if you ever have you think about a lot of things in lives where when you just have one leader and a lot of followers, right? Well, what if that leader makes a mistake? Things head off in the wrong direction real quick.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about resilience, okay, and how do you get there? Alternate PNT can be one way. So you're not relying on that one leader. And another model, though, when you think about the alternates, you don't want the alternates to still have the same single single leader, multiple follower model. You want those other alternatives to, I think, have more of a decentralized approach
mm-hmm.
to how they solve the problem, where instead of having a leader and a bunch of followers, you have more what I like to think of as a peer-to-peer connection.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I can give a little analogy here.
Go ahead. Go for it.
Have some fun. You think about our world today, right? We live in different time zones. Some live, let's say, on the West Coast, some on the East Coast, some in Mountain Standard Time. The clock, in California is 3 hours behind the clock on the East Coast, really, right?
Always.
And the clock on the East Coast is 2 hours ahead of the clock in Mountain Standard Time. In most Mountain Standard, maybe not here in Arizona, but the point is that we operate on different clocks.
Mhm.
Okay. And even though we operate on different clocks, we're still able to get things done. Because if I'm in Colorado, I know I'm 2 hours behind the person in the East Coast, and I can still schedule a meeting and we can synchronize, if you will, our time zones and coordinate so that we can all be on the call at the same time.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting about that is, again, the clocks are running in different time zones. It's not all 12 o'clock is not 12 o'clock everywhere, right? But it's a matter of knowing that clock offset, if you will, if I can get a little technical, right? Knowing how far off we are from one another, we can still coordinate. And this is an example of what I would call decentralized timing, right? Where you can have these different clocks, yet you can still coordinate and get something done. And that model, I think, is a very interesting model to apply to the problem we need to solve with critical infrastructure. Decentralizing things, not having a single leader and a bunch of followers, but having actually separated clocks that know how far off they are from one another and can still act in a synchronized manner.
So that if the signal's ever broken on one, there's redundancy and backup. Is that the idea?
You got it. That's exactly the point.
Right.
There's no single point of failure. Right. Get away from that. I think as we look at alternative PNT options, we need to look at getting away from single points of failure.
So how would we do that if it's not up in space? What are some alternatives we're talking about?
Well, what we're seeing more and more is countries, for that matter, even wanting to bring the clock that's up in space that they're making use of right now, bring that onto the ground, okay, and find other ways to distribute that time throughout, for example, their country. There's lots of techniques out there. There's ways to distribute time over fiber optic connections. There's ways to distribute time over RF connections. There's ways to have clocks on the ground, but to still distribute the time over a satellite connection. There's various ways to do it. And which gets to another point, right? About resilience, back to the goal. How do you get there? Alternate or multi-PNT, I think, is what we really need to shoot for, right? It's not a matter of saying, oh, this particular PNT alternative is the perfect solution. No, I think it's more about having a multi-PNT approach to choose from.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Microchip, brought to you by Microchip Technology. This concludes part 1 of our 2-part episode, Alternative PNT and Hollywood Spy Thrillers Come to Life. Join us next time as we pick up our conversation where we left off and explore the technology behind position, navigation, and timing. Thanks for listening.